Tonight when you go to bed, you might lie awake for a while. It's the thing you do before anything big. A presentation in the morning, an exam you've been dreading, something you just can't stop turning over in your head. Now imagine you couldn't sleep because tomorrow you might actually die, not in some metaphorical sense, properly physically die, in front of 50,000 people. For 700 years of Roman history, men prepared for exactly that night. Tens of thousands of them, walking into hundreds of arenas across the empire, every single one of them lying awake at some point the evening before. And almost nobody has ever asked what they actually did during those hours. The answer changes almost everything you think you know about gladiators. Because here's the picture most of us carry around in our heads. A slave dragged out of a dungeon at dawn, a desperate man with no choice, shoved through a gate at the point of a spear and told to fight or die. That picture is almost entirely wrong. About a third of all Roman gladiators were actually volunteers. They signed a contract called the Sacramentum Gladiatorium, in which a man formally agreed to be burned, to be bound, to be beaten, and to be killed by the sword. Those were the actual words written into the document. And men still walked in off the street and signed it. The reason was money. One fight in the arena paid more than a Roman legionary earned in an entire month, and the best gladiators became some of the most famous people in the empire. Their faces were painted onto oil lamps and pressed into mosaics sold in markets from Britain to Syria. One piece of graffiti carved into a wall in Pompeii reads, "Celadus the Thracian makes the girls sigh." Celadus was a real man who fought in the arena, and somebody, some fan, some admirer, felt the need to scratch that into a public wall, permanently in stone. You don't write graffiti like that about a man being dragged to slaughter. You write it about a star. These weren't desperate slaves shuffling toward death. They were professional athletes who happened to work in a sport where dying was sometimes one of the outcomes. The places where these men lived and trained were called ludi, gladiatorial schools, not dungeons. The largest of them, the Ludus Magnus, sat directly beside the Colosseum in Rome and was connected to it by its own private underground tunnel. Inside, there was a full training arena, medical wards staffed around the clock, and private rooms where individual fighters slept, not cells. Real rooms with real beds, because the Romans spent an enormous amount of money on these places, and a dead gladiator the day before a fight was money set on fire. Each fighter trained in a specific style, such as the Murmillo, the Retiarius, and the Thrakes, each matched by tradition against a natural opponent the crowd had opinions about. And the school doctors were some of the best physicians in the ancient world. Galen himself started his career treating gladiators. And then there's what they ate, which is where most of the picture in your head falls apart. You're probably imagining meat and blood, some kind of warrior diet built for a man whose job is to kill other men in front of a crowd. It was the opposite of that. The Romans actually had a nickname for gladiators that survives in the written record. Hordearia, which translates as barley men. Their diet was almost entirely beans, barley, and a thick gruel made by dissolving wood ash in water and drinking it down every single day. The ash gave them calcium, which their bones needed to recover from the constant damage of training, and the school doctors tracked all of it the way a modern team tracks an elite athlete. The diet had a specific purpose, and it had nothing to do with strength. A high-carb intake builds a thick, even layer of fat just beneath the skin, sitting right on top of the muscle. In the arena, that fat was armor. A sword cut that would have hit bone on a lean fighter bled out through the fat instead, and the wound looked spectacular without doing any real damage. The fighter kept going, the crowd lost its mind. That was the entire point. The Romans had figured out sports science 2,000 years before anyone gave it that name. Once you put all of that together, the volunteer contract, the years of specialist training, the school full of expensive bodies, the diet engineered to bleed dramatically without killing, the night before stopped looking like a death watch. The actual death rate, when you run the numbers, was about 1 fight in 9. Real and significant, but a long way from the slaughter most people picture. The night before, for the man living it, was the night before something he had probably done dozens of times already. It was the biggest performance of his life. The owner of the school knew exactly which of his fighters were scheduled, and he knew which kind of fight each one was. Fights to the death, while real, were actually relatively uncommon. They required special permission from whoever was paying for the games, and they cost extra because killing your own asset is not good business. Most fights ended a different way. One man going down, one man raising his index finger to the crowd, and the whole arena deciding together what came next. This was known. The range of possible outcomes was understood by every man who would sleep in those rooms that night. So, the night before. It started with the Cena Libera. The night before any major games, the fighters were brought out to a long public table and fed properly. Real food this time, meat and bread and wine, none of the usual barley gruel, and the entire city came out to watch them eat. This was not a quiet meal. In the days leading up to the games, posters had been painted on walls all across Rome announcing who was fighting. Names, records, fighting styles, win-loss tallies, all of it public. The whole city knew, the whole city had opinions, the whole city had its favorites. And on the evening of the Cena Libera, they all showed up to see those favorites eating bread and looking for once like ordinary men. Fans pressed in close to look at the men whose names they had been saying all week. Some came to cheer them on, some just came to stare. Others came for different reasons. If a gladiator had family nearby, a wife, children, a brother, they came that evening because the arena the next day was not a place for them. The Cena Libera was often the last chance those families would have before whatever was going to happen happened. Picture what that actually looked like. A man eating slowly at a long public table, his wife sitting across from him, his children beside her, and strangers pressing in from every direction just to stare. Some of those strangers were crying, and the man just kept eating. A Roman philosopher named Seneca watched one of these feasts and wrote about it afterwards. He described fighters eating in complete calm while the crowd around them wept openly. He called it one of the most striking things he had ever seen in his life. What he did not mention, probably did not even think to mention, was that many of these men had done this exact thing before. Some of them 20 times, some of them 30. They had learned how to be still, how to sit at that table with everyone watching and not let any of it show on their face. And then after the feast they went back to the school. This is where it gets properly human. Inside the walls of the ludus, away from the crowds and the noise and the strangers staring, the rest of the night was theirs. What we know about how they actually spent those hours comes from fragments, graffiti scratched into walls, letters that survived, administrative records, and those fragments tell a story we'd recognize. Some of them wrote not grand farewell letters about honor and courage, but practical ones. What to do with their belongings if it went wrong, who to contact, where their money was kept, the kind of letter you write when you are quietly preparing for the possibility that you might not come back. Some of them prayed, and what they chose to pray to tells you something about how all of this actually worked. Every gladiatorial school in the entire Roman Empire had a shrine inside it dedicated to Nemesis, the goddess of fate and deserved consequence. For gladiators, she meant something very specific. She was the patron of the final second in the arena, the moment when a thumb moved one way or the other and a life either continued or did not. Archaeologists have found her shrines in the ruins of gladiator schools from Rome to Carnuntum in what is now Austria. At Carnuntum, the stone at the base of the shrine has been worn completely smooth, polished by hundreds of hands over hundreds of years. These were men who had killed other men in that arena, men with their own names carved into public walls by strangers all over the city. Men who had survived this 30 or 40 times already. And those men got on their knees the night before in the dark and asked quietly to be spared one more time. Some of the gladiators had families, a wife, children. Records show that brief visits did happen on evenings before scheduled fights, held inside the fighter's own private room, not in some holding cell at the back. A small room with a lamp and a bed. The same room he slept in every other night. Not every gladiator had someone to visit. Some were far from home, some had left everything they knew behind in order to sign that contract. But the ones who did have families sat in those rooms with the lamp burning low and the door closed. They thought about the opponent they would face in the morning, and about what the trainer had told them to watch for. They thought about the people who had just walked out the door. In the morning they dressed. The armor was fitted in a specific order. Greaves first, then the padding, then the heavy bronze plates, and the helmet on last. The helmet was the heaviest piece. It narrowed your vision down to a slit and changed the way sound reached you, and the moment it went on, something inside you shifted. The part of your mind that had been running all night went quiet. The part that had been training for years took over. Then the tunnel, the underground passage from the school straight to the Colosseum, ran for several hundred meters beneath the streets of Rome. The noise of the crowd reached you through the stone before you could see anything, growing louder and more solid with every step you took. The air warmed as you got closer. The gate appeared at the end of the tunnel. Light came through the edges of it. And then you walked out into 50,000 people. And the night before was very far away. Most of those men walked back through that same tunnel a few hours later. The man who had spent the previous evening writing careful letters and kneeling at a worn shrine and sitting quietly with his family in a small lamplit room, that man often came home. He ate, he slept. And when the next fight was posted on the wall outside the school, he did the whole thing all over again. Here's the thing nobody tells you about the night before something hard. The stress response your body runs tonight, the racing thoughts, the inability to sleep, the chest that won't settle, is not a modern condition. It's not insomnia. It's not weakness. It's the same physiological system that prepared a gladiator the night before he walked into the arena. The same hormones in the same sequence. It was built for tomorrows that could actually kill you. Your body has no way of knowing the difference between a man with a sword and a meeting in the morning. It runs the program either way. So when you lie there at 2 in the morning thinking something is wrong with you, what's actually happening is an ancient piece of machinery doing what it has always done, applied to a problem it was never designed for. The gladiators had a routine for the night before. A meal in public, a letter written carefully, a shrine in the corner of the room, a wife visiting through a door that closed quietly behind her. You have a phone screen at 2 a.m. The night before is one of the oldest things in your body. They just had something to do with it.